Hello, let's talk about the Blood Brothers characters. Okay, so these are the key characters from the play Blood Brothers, which you may well be studying on GCSE English Literature. So, natural place to start is with Mickey. Mickey is one of our protagonists. He is, of course, the biological twin of none other than Edward. Now, the interesting thing, I guess, about Mickey, the most important thing to know about is that he is a representation of the working classes. Okay? And what I mean by that is these sort of lower status, particularly in the time that the play is set, between the 1950s and 1970s. We obviously see the struggles that he has, for example, with things like self-esteem, with things like work, and really what Willie Russell, so the playwright, uses him to do is to make a statement, to make a kind of comment that the class system in the UK essentially restricts and controls people, right? Now, of course, we know that very sadly Mickey dies. He completes the tragedy in this way. But of course, if you're writing about Mickey, what you're really writing about is the working classes. Now, you can't write about Mickey without writing, of course, about his brother, Edward. So Edward is obviously sort of taken at birth from Mrs. Johnston, there she is, and given to Mrs. Lyons. And because of this very small accident of time, he gets a much more privileged upbringing. Okay, he gets a much more privileged upbringing. He gets to go to, for example, a much nicer school, gets to go to a grammar school. He gets to experience university. He doesn't have to worry about financial issues. And generally, he lives a much more enjoyable life. But of course, the outcome is the same. He also dies. He is killed by his brother, Mickey. And again, I think what Russell is trying to say here, and I'll use the letter R to depict that, Russell is essentially saying all aspects of British society will suffer if the working classes aren't protected and supported and allowed to flourish. So again, we're looking here, I guess, in some ways at opposites, aren't we? Opposite characters in terms of background. But the interesting thing about Blood Brothers is that the core is the same. Okay, the core is the same. Now, Mrs. Johnston here depicted somewhat older. She, of course, worries, doesn't she, about her looks fading. We have that kind of constant comparison in her minds with Marilyn Monroe. But who is Mrs. Johnston? Well, she is the mother of both Mickey and Edward, biological mother and mother to Mickey. And I guess in some ways, she's another working class character. She obviously struggles, but her heart remains pure, doesn't it? She's this very good and virtuous character. She does what she thinks is right, even though obviously giving away her son is very controversial and complex. She does it from a place of or from a place of warmth. She wants what's best for her children. Now, I always like breaking her name up, John Stone. Okay, so obviously the John here reflecting her kind of simplistic background. She's kind of a representation of the everyman. Of course, she's a woman. But the stone aspect shows that there's something precious about her, something that needs to be something valuable, something again that needs to be protected. Okay. She is obviously in some ways the biggest loser when it comes to the tragedy. She suffers greatly. She loses both of her sons for something that she in some ways kind of an environment that she created. Mrs. Lyons. Now, very complex character. Obviously, she's much more kind of upper class. She's a stay-at-home mother, something that comes as a luxury because obviously her husband works for a very wealthy, is very wealthy and works for a very sort of successful company. But she has her own tragedy, she has her own struggle, and that is a struggle with fertility. She can't have children of her own. Which makes her, initially at least, somewhat of a sympathetic character. There is a certain sympathy for her. And you can understand why she takes Edward, because she's willing to do anything to have children. However, while she's not quite a villain, she is villainous. And she's villainous because she obviously manipulates Mrs. Johnston, makes her obviously very frightened, very scared. And Russell obviously uses her, I guess, initially in some ways quite an interesting way, as an object of both sympathy and revulsion. And what I mean by revulsion is obviously we feel somewhat repulsed by her actions. But at the same time, we can understand why she does them. And that's because I guess nothing in Blood Brothers is necessarily, there's no clear good and evil characters. There are only characters thrown into the circumstances that they're in and responding in the way that they think is best. We have Sammy. So that's Mickey's older brother. Now, Sammy is sort of used to represent this idea that without proper support, without proper opportunity, the working classes will turn to violence and crime. He threatens a bus conductor, he orchestrates the robbery that gets Mickey involved. He's obviously the one with the weapon. And even from very early in the play, he engages in these violent games, okay? And it's almost, I guess, obviously it's an example of foreshadowing, but it's also an example from Willie Russell that these characters, it's almost like destiny in a way for people like Sammy. They're destined to end up doing the things that they do. It's with them from the day that they're born. And that can only be as an influence of society. But who represents society? I think it's the narrator. This narrator character who also acts as a kind of omniscient guide. In the Greek tradition, we can see him as an example of the chorus, this individual or group of individuals who provide judgment. But he obviously sets in motion the tragedy in the opening, where he essentially lays out the story of what will happen, that these two twins, will sadly die. And he creates that sense of inevitability that drives the story. Okay, but when I say he represents society, because society, British society, watches events. Okay, we see things happening in the news, in our communities, in our country. But what do we do? And what does the narrator do? Does he make a change? Does he make a difference? Or does he just observe? So Willie Russell kind of asks this question, if we want things to change, we have to engage in that change. Thank you for watching.